I should like to thank you for attending the last session of today, which I think is nevertheless going to be among the most interesting. Some 10 years ago, I produced a paper on trying to measure academic freedom, which appeared in the UNESCO journal Higher Education Policy. I previously contacted the editor, a notable scholar called Guy, about producing this. And he said to me in uncertain terms, don't try, it's impossible. Now, when you say that to an academic, obviously, the first thing he does is try very hard. So I did, in fact, manage to produce, at least within Europe, some idea of university rankings in terms of academic freedom. And my work has gone on from there. But I'm very delighted to see 3 scholars now taking up the cudgels with respect to trying to design an index for academic freedom. So I should firstly like to introduce them and then ask them to come to the podium and give you some indication as to the approaches they're taking. To my left, I have Katrin. Katrin Kinzelbach is Associate Director at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, Germany, visiting professor at the Central European University's School of Public Policy in Budapest. Her ongoing research focuses on political persecution, and she was awarded a Schumpeter Fellowship by the Volkswagen Foundation. Katrin holds a PhD from the University of Vienna. To my near right, we have Dominique. Dominique Marlet is leading the rights work of Education International, a global network of education unions about which she'll be talking, including higher education. I'm thrilled to have her here, not least because EI has done a great deal of work with respect to its barometer of human and trade rights. So they have a great deal of experience in this area from which I'm sure we will benefit. And finally, here, to my far right, we have Ilyas Saliba, who's co-author of a very interesting paper I discovered quite by accident. The only reason I discovered it is I keep checking to see who's citing me, and he'd cited me. So I immediately thought, right, what's he said about me? And checked on the paper. He is author of a recent article that proposed a similar approach with respect to the development of a measurement tool. He's also a research fellow at WZB. And so, without further ado, I should like Katrin to take the floor. You want to go first?
Yeah.
I do apologise. You want to take the floor?
Yeah.
Right, sir. Off you go.
And I'm supposed to, like this?
Stand up or should we sit?
It's entirely up to you.
I think people can hear you better.
They can hear you better with it, with the mic. It's easy to hear you.
Did you use this one?
Surely.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, first of all, and thank you for the turnout at the end of this, towards the end of this conference. Happy to see people are still around and interested in such an important topic. I think that's something we can definitely all agree on. I'm just going to start off with telling you maybe how me and my co-author Janos, who published this article recently on trying to conceptualize how to measure academic freedom in the form of an index, have actually even come to undertake this project, kind of the motives behind it, and also this will then kind of identify the gap to some extent. I won't go too much into detail on what we propose, because I'll give Katrin the possibility also to talk a bit more about her approach, and then we can maybe tackle upon the, if that's wanted, upon the methodological details in the discussion. Otherwise, we've also thought about talking about the use of such an index once it is established for other means than just research. So basically, this photo, maybe some of you know this person. This is Giulio Regeni, a former Cambridge University PhD student. I was in Cairo at the same time when he was there, and also at the same time when he was killed. Basically, information was coming out slowly and slowly, what happened to him. We were, of course, sitting there in Cairo. I was sharing a flat with a professor from American University in Cairo at the time, and discussing this case and discussing the risk of pursuing research in Egypt, fieldwork research, on-the-ground research, interview-based, which was basically the same stuff I was doing, and a lot of other friends and colleagues we knew that were in Cairo were doing at the same time. So this kind of got us thinking, obviously, and there are several projects that came out of this, but this is one of them. And actually Yannis, who's the co-author of the article that Terence has just mentioned, is also a researcher who has been focusing on Egypt in his work. So this was kind of a common denominator to start with. This exemplary kind of horrible story of Giulio Regeni, which started us, oh, this way, okay. Well, as you know, this is not the only example. I'm just bringing these two examples here. This is the protests against the Lex CEU. I think this has been already talked about in the context of this conference, so I don't need to tell you about the story. But what this kind of sparked between me and a couple of colleagues was a debate on what data is actually out there, how can we measure these very different things, right? I mean, on the one hand, you have an Italian PhD student who is pursuing fieldwork in Egypt, in a foreign country, and then kind of ends up dead in a ditch. And on the other hand, you have a legalistic approach by a democratic state EU member to try to curb academic freedom of a specific institution. Two very different phenomena, right? But in the end, if you think of it from a measurement perspective, they are two sides of the same coin to some extent. They are both kind of under the umbrella of what we would call violations of academic freedom. We tried to look into kind of, both of us coming from political science, Yannis more from social movement studies, me more from comparative politics, looking into what data is actually out there on academic freedom. And what we found, what we first turned to was the well-established democracy indices, Freedom House, Polity, etc., Bertelsmann, there are a few others. And there I knew people involved, and you can of course also download the reports, and academic freedom didn't really seem to be systematically evaluated in those. If at all, it was sub-aggregated under freedom of speech, and if at all, there was one question in the questionnaire, which is mainly these reports are expert questionnaire based, and then there was one question: how free is the university or academic freedom? How would you assess it? That's it. So of course, if you bear in mind the complexity of the different two examples that I've just given you of the CEU case and the Giulio Regeni case, it's very hard to kind of assess that on the basis of this one question. So we kind of looked into other literatures that were a bit further away from our own fields. So, for example, the work of Terence and others. We found that we wanted to maybe conceptualize something like an index that would be able to combine various methods and various sources of data to actually cover as wide range as possible of violations of academic freedom, from very soft or subtle kind of person won't receive funding due to their political stance or something like that, or the perceived political stance of their research, to the extreme cases of killings, beating down protesters, student protesters in universities, and so on. So we came up with this index. We have three main dimensions. One is the personal, which is mainly kind of really infringements of human rights, but we then consider them violations of academic freedom if that individual is that the case is about is targeted due to their work as an academic, right? So this is also, of course, something very complicated that we've been debating hotly. So it's very hard sometimes to draw the line, right? Because professors or students are, of course, also politically active. And is that two different roles? If they're persecuted for their political actions, is that a violation of academic freedom, or is that a violation of their human rights? Sometimes it's very hard to differentiate. I think this is still something we have to debate also within the literature and among scholars that deal with this. But nevertheless, this is kind of the first basis, the first dimension we've identified, and then we have several subscores. The second one is legal means, so kind of the legal context, and this is something that Terence has been championing, especially with respect to Europe and the European context. So analyzing the legal basis for academic freedom, which also goes into institutional autonomy and these kind of concepts that are very important in the literature on academic freedom. And then lastly, we've kind of tried to conceptualize the economic dimension of academic freedom and try to come up with some measurements, ideas for that. And that would be kind of, funding and how far funding is provided independently by state or non-state authorities, or in how far there is a loss of position as a retaliatory discharge due to your political stance as a researcher, you lose your job, such as we've seen in Turkey recently, or also we wanted to try to capture, but that we haven't been really successful in yet, in how far funding goes to different professors, different disciplines also, because of political meaning to those. So this is what we've done and recently published in 2017 in a journal called Interdisciplinary Political Studies. And it's really just a first attempt from our side to come up with a measure of global and kind of also, which would work across time and space, measure of academic freedom. And it's also, of course, something to start a debate. I mean, this was kind of the aim of writing this article, and I'm very happy to see that people who have been having this debate for a long time, such as Terence and others, but also people who identified a similar gap in the literature and have come kind of also joining in these efforts, or also made their independent efforts actually to come up with something similar. And I'm really happy and glad to be here to discuss this with the people on the panel. And with that, I'm going to leave it to Katrin.
Do you have the thing?
Oh, so did I take it? No.
Here it is.
Okay.
Okay, so my name is Katrin Kinzelbach. I will present the report Forbidden Knowledge. I don't know if you managed to still grab a copy, because apparently there are not so many left. Thank you very much for the interest. But you hopefully can get this little information which allows you to download the report. It's a summary of an expert consultation that took place at the Fritz Thyssen Foundation in Cologne in November last year. Yes, it's better here, right? My co-author Felix Hoffmann is also here, but really this is a report of a collaborative effort. A number of people who are here at the conference took part. Terence, Karran, Robert Quinn, and Lauren Crane from Scholars at Risk, Eva Pils, who just spoke on the China panel, Kwatwo Apiagai-Atwa, who might be here, no? Johannes Müller, Husamedin Darwish, Monika Steinl are also here today, and a number of others that participated in Cologne. Is very important for me to emphasize that our report really is based on a discussion where a lot of people contributed. Now, here to give you an impression, we tried to assemble a number of people of whom we knew that they had been working on measuring academic freedom for a long time. Other people like Ilyas we met later. So this is definitely not the first attempt to try and conceptualize the measurement of academic freedom, but I think the specific contribution that this conference was able to make is that it brought together experts on higher education with advocacy groups, affected scholars, people who focus on repression, studying repression, but also experts on indices. We had an expert on democracy indexing and an expert on ranking universities there. And we really tried to put our heads together to figure out, what available measurement options do we have and what could work well. So, the first difficult question is, what do we measure when we speak about academic freedom? And as the subtitle of our report reads, political repression in the university sector. We, to make this short, started, of course, from the academic freedom as a professional freedom perspective, but then adopted an approach that the Scholars at Risk Network has developed, which is sort of a three-tiered approach that, in addition to academic freedom as a professional freedom, also includes a socially engaged academic freedom, whereby the scholar shouldn't only be free within the campus, but also be allowed to carry results of his or her research into society. And then, as a third element, human rights of academics. And we then looked at, and we actually discussed a number of country case studies and tried to identify common infringements of academic freedom. Here you see us standing there with a pyramid. And the result of that effort is now in the report a little bit more organized. It looks like this. We have basically 3 levels that we feel are important to cover as a country level, where you'd find things like, higher education laws, but also, fiscal policy on higher education, but also criminalization of networks, for example, or professional organizations. And I think those that focus on repression in our group felt that foreign agent laws, far-reaching anti-terrorism laws are really something that you also ought to consider. Then at the university level, a number of aspects from, union and tenure abolishment to classroom surveillance and restricted access to libraries, restrictions on research collaboration, those kinds of issues. And at an individual level, the things that the SAR monitor covers are more here in the hard repression corner. So detentions, forced exile, and then also loss of position, but also more subtle means, such as self-censorship. I think one of the most important aspects to measure and one of the most difficult. Yeah? And then we asked ourselves, so how can we actually measure these infringements? And here you see us debating the pros and cons of different methodologies, which we summarized in the report, and also a number of open questions that we identified. Here you can see what we considered. So we started from the legal analysis, which I think is amongst the most developed frameworks for analysis, thanks to Terence's work. Then we considered self-reporting by universities, which is something that is used in university rankings, but in the context of academic freedom, highly problematic as a data source. We discussed the pros and cons of surveys. I think an alternative is sort of focus groups if you can't run surveys. We had a long discussion on events data, so data on arrests and disappearances and loss of position. That we do have thanks to the SAR network, but which is probably not an objective reflection of all the violations that go on around the world. And also looked at, can social media and automated social media analysis maybe be complementary to the events data that is being gathered, or media sources. What then do you do in countries where the official media is under control? So to cut a long story short, all of these methods, they come with some pros and a lot of cons. And in the end, we also discussed expert assessments, which are a very common methodology used in indexing, not without its flaws. But I think the majority of us, not all of us, but the majority of us in Cologne felt that this is actually a promising route to pursue. We then overlapped our initial pyramid with the common infringements that we identified, with the methods that we discussed, and found that, you know, you have some methods that are very good for measuring some aspects of the issue, but usually not all aspects, right? And so expert analysis, I think, would be a good and promising way to bring the different data types that we have together, to interpret the available data, but to also to contextualize it. Because what we want to have in the end, obviously, if you talk about measurement, is a comparable data set, right? We want to have meaningful data that can tell us how is academic freedom in Indonesia in comparison to academic freedom in Indonesia 2-3 years ago, but also in comparison to Costa Rica or to the UK. And this is the difficulty of, that we face. And I think the expert analysis, because of its possibility not only to contextualize data, but also because you can organize regional calibration rounds and global calibration rounds where you precisely have those discussions and you question whether or not the assessments compare, are the most promising route. Now, there are a number of challenges, for sure, if we were to move forward on an index project. Which the first one, I think, is that we have highly different country contexts. We had a preliminary discussion on Monday in one of the pre-Congress sessions. And, you know, the types of challenges that we face on academic freedom, for example, in Europe are very, very different from the types of challenges in high-capacity states. So one question that we haven't resolved yet is whether indeed it makes sense to put all of these countries on the same ranking list, or whether you need to maybe have peer groups where you try to compare countries that are comparable in terms of their political system, or are comparable in terms of their, you know, economic development with each other, rather than putting the whole world on one index. The downside of that is in terms of communication. These indices, as we know, attract a lot of attention, help to put this topic on a political agenda, and if you make it too complicated, then the researchers will love it, but the journalists won't like it. And this is something that I think we need to discuss, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. We also need to know that the index will be politicized, that's for sure. And so if we continue with the route of experts assessments, you know, then in addition to developing a detailed code book, which we haven't done yet, we need to be really sure that these experts don't get co-opted, that they follow rigorously the guidelines for interpreting data. And of course, it has financial implications if you need experts for all the countries around the world, plus probably also people who peer review the country reports. So there's lots of questions to still think about, but I believe it can be done. And here are the next steps. So here, the opportunity of the Congress for us is to seek critical feedback on the idea. I think the next step would be to set up an advisory board and apply for funding for a code book. And then once the code book is written up, I think we need a few pilot studies, 4 or 5, ideally very different countries, to figure out whether the code book works in these different contexts, whether it's clear, whether the results are meaningful. And then hopefully seek partners and I think importantly to develop an incentive structure for academics to participate in these assessments. And then in an ideal scenario, meet again at the next Global Congress in 2020 to launch this and go beyond pilot cases. If you want to learn more, then I encourage you to look at the report. If you have critical feedback or you're interested in participating, and not everybody might get a chance to speak, please feel free to contact me at this address here. We also thought, and I want to close with this, you know, once we have the index, it will enrich research, but will it make a difference for academic freedom? And I think here the most important thing to get right is that it needs to cover the right aspects, because indexes set incentives, and if the incentives are set wrong, then it might do more harm than good. And I think that's something that I'd really be interested in hearing from you. For an index to be successful, based on your experience, what would it have to accomplish and what should it not do, so that it has a positive effect, not only on our advancement of research on academic freedom, but also on the realization of academic freedom. Thank you.
Hello. I will start by giving you some background on what my organization is and represents. It's called Education International, and it is a global federation of education unions and teacher professional organizations. We usually say we are the voice of 32.5 million teachers, academics, researchers, education support personnel through 400 member organizations in 192 countries. We also represent higher education personnel. About 3 million of them are represented through the organizations affiliated to us. We are a federation of independent education unions, which means we have no affiliate in China or in most of the Middle East countries. The work we do is to defend the rights of professionals through promoting a better status, good working conditions, support, but also academic freedom. This is a very important component of the work we do. We are also supporting the right to education of all children, all scholars, all adults throughout their lives in all countries. We promote quality, public, free education for all through representation with governments, with international and intergovernmental organizations. The reason we're here today is because of the partnership we have with Scholars at Risk, where we defend academic freedom in a number of countries. Some have been discussed here, Turkey, Iran, Venezuela. We also work in Ethiopia, Philippines, Kenya, Colombia, Zimbabwe, Cambodia, Iraq, Fiji, and the list, unfortunately, is not exhaustive. Because, of course, the reality of education and of higher education is one characterized by austerity, where the states withdraw their funding from higher education. This is not a news to you. Corporate funding goes with strings attached and with a specific agenda. The workers have increased casualization, precarity through short-term contracts, fewer benefits, no involvement in collegial governance. All this has an impact on academic freedom through self-censorship, through fear of expressing one's views, because a contract can be abrogated, research can be altered. I mean, you know all the stories. So we believe that academic freedom is really a threat and need to be given more visibility. And therefore, this initiative of the index is very much welcome. because we believe that academic freedom should be an important component of the reputation of universities and of countries. So any instrument that would put a spotlight on academic freedom would be something that we would be supporting. Because in addition to giving visibility, an index would provide evidence-based data to promote advocacy, and you were alluding to this. As education unions, for example, once we have a solid report showing that academic freedom is being threatened in one particular university, in one particular country, it helps to actually advocate and lobby to defend it. We believe it can also be used for submitting allegations to the supervisory mechanisms provided by intergovernmental organizations, like through UNESCO, for example, or through the EU or the African Union, the UPR mechanism at the United Nations. If we have solid facts, allegations can be submitted. What we also very much appreciate in your initiative is that your definition of academic freedom is taken from the recommendation of 1997, and this is something that is really important. The difficulties, of course, are the methodology. You've alluded to it, and you have mentioned in the presentation that Education International has released a barometer on human and trade union rights. This is an initiative going back to 1998. Academic freedom is an entry in this barometer, but there is hardly any information. The reason being that because we are a, what can I say, a partisan organization, if you want, we wanted the information that we were using to be considered valid and credible. And therefore, we only used in that barometer information that we took from UN agencies, from official databases. And there is actually very little on academic freedom that we could be using in our barometer. So therefore, most of the entries are unfortunately quite empty. Another difficulty of the index, of course, is how to compare different situations, and you have also alluded to this. The mechanisms to collect data can also be quite tricky about the credibility, for example, of the source, the subjectivity, the fact that academic freedom, unfortunately, is not a very known and shared concept. So quite often, especially in the countries that are most at risk, we would find out that academics are not fully aware of what this notion involves and may not always identify when there is an infringement. The fear of persecution, if individuals were to report, is also a factor that needs to be taken into account. And something that we experience when we carry survey throughout the world is the language issue. Quite often the Asian region would not be accurately represented. And a side note, there are not many representatives from the Asia region at this Congress. And I believe that the language barrier may be one of the reasons. I mean, it's very difficult to engage with academics in Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, to just name a few. And so having their engagement in collecting information for such an index might be difficult. An index, as you also said, it's a league table. And it attracts media attention, of course, but the ranking is also makes us a bit uneasy, because at the end of the table you will have the most dispossessed countries, and so It's always the same that will be at the end of the list, and always the same that will be on the top of the list. Just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the global federation of interprofessional unions, issued an index on human and trade union rights, and the first country, so the best ranking country, was Denmark. I don't know, are there any representatives of Denmark here? No, so I can, I can talk. Yes. So Denmark, wonderful country, social democrat country, wonderful, except that at the time of the index, the education authorities refused to bargain with the teacher union. That was in 2013, and they issued a lockout, meaning that the schools were closed and teachers could not work anymore because the employer would not work with them anymore. And nowadays, Denmark is issuing another lockout, but now for all public servants. So you have now 500,000 public servants that are without employment because the government refuses to negotiate wages with the unions. Now, does that mean they should be top of the list from a global trade union organization making an index? This raises some question. But of course, I mean, every proposal has downside. And the last thing, an index would highlight the symptoms, but not really address the structural and systemic problems. The index might help to address these, of course. I will conclude by saying that we very much welcome this initiative, and we are prepared to help to encourage our member organizations in the various countries to engage and to contribute where they can to maybe to feed in the discussion about the methodology, and if there is a possibility to be on the advisory board, consider us.
Well, before we ask for any questions, I should, because there's no one from Denmark here, I can say this. I did my own study looking at academic freedom in Europe, and Denmark came out near the very bottom. The UK was, of course, at the bottom. Mm-hmm. So this was reported in the Danish press, and the Danish higher education minister, Helge Sanger, came under increased pressure. The Danish trade union for academics then put up an online petition, which was signed by the majority of the academics. They then, with my help, produced an application to UNESCO that the law in Denmark did not protect academic freedom. At this stage, the government then took fright. It set up an international evaluation committee, which examined the law and concluded the law was unjust, and it changed the law. So sometimes rankings do have a positive outcome, not always. It's worth noting that work I've done recently in the UK came to the same conclusion, and that the trade union in the United Kingdom that represents university academics is also going to make an appeal to UNESCO. It may be the case that the law will be changed in the United Kingdom as well. So rankings often, they may have dysfunctional aspects, but they can also have good outcomes. And I'd like now to ask anyone any questions. We have hands up. Has someone got the microphone, please? So first you, then you? Okay, thank you. The microphone's coming, it's just taking a bit of time. Come on, colleagues, come on.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentations. I have one question for Katrin. You mentioned classroom surveillance, but it seems, or if I understood you correctly, the focus will be laid mostly on professionals or employed academics. And I'm wondering how and if you're planning to include the students and young researchers' perspectives, because I was familiar with the Indian context, of course. There will be very different
Okay, so one-on-one responses, I guess. Okay, so no, what we said at the individual level in the report is that not only teaching personnel, but also students and also non-teaching personnel of universities should be considered. How you best do that is I think, the big methodological question. We had somebody in Cologne who runs all the student surveys here in Germany for the Zeit ranking, and is also working on a project called U Multirank, which is a sort of alternative index that looks also at student perspectives. And the way they administer their surveys with the students is that through the universities. So the universities get detailed instructions on random sampling and one-time access code for the electronic survey, and all is well and nice. But of course, you have no control over how these institutions actually administer the surveys, right? I think Terence has more experience on surveys than I have, but I work on China, and I think in a country context such as China, it is not possible to conduct surveys. Even focus groups are hard to organize without putting your participants at serious risk. And so this is a consideration we've discussed a lot. And I think here again, if we do work with experts and they have clear guidelines that they do need to answer questions on the student perspective, and they also need to explain how they get to their conclusions, then they could adapt to the specific country context. Where they can run surveys and where they can run focus groups, they should, but where they cannot, maybe they have some individual conversations and then they can share their best judgment, right? On the point of classroom surveillance, I think this is a really good example for why you need an expert to contextualize. So when I hear classroom surveillance, I immediately think of a repressive context. But I heard from some schools in the UK that do systematic recording of all classroom discussions in order to facilitate access for people who may not be there on that day or who may not be able to enter the classroom or whatever. So the idea there is to increase access to education, and maybe it serves that function, but in a repressive context it clearly doesn't. So if you only ask, are classes recorded, what does it tell you? Right? You need somebody to contextualize that information. And therefore, I believe that we need to involve people who know those countries in the assessment of the information.
Yeah, I don't really have a question. She's calling from the German Federal Foreign Office, and more of a remark or suggestion. Several countries, for example, Kazakhstan, Saudi Arabia, or China, set out goals for their higher education landscape to improve the ranking of the universities in certain indices. And most of these indices do not include academic freedom. So my suggestion is not only to have a separate index on academic freedom, but also to include it in the long run in these general rankings, because that will also put a bit of pressure on certain countries to recognize the importance of academic freedom.
I can answer that directly. Quite recently I did some work looking at protection for academic freedom and world university rankings. And the Times Higher very kindly gave me access to some of its data. What did we find? Those institutions that best protect academic freedom also occupy the higher ranking positions in the Times Higher. And this is statistically without a doubt. We use 90 institutions in the United Kingdom to show this categorically. Conversely, those institutions which do not protect academic freedom occupy lower ranking positions. And in one sense, the lesson for rectors and politicians alike is, if you want to develop a university that's going to occupy high places, you not only need to resource it, but you also need to deal with an academic climate that promotes academic freedom. Otherwise, you just will not succeed. Yeah, sure.
really quickly to add to this. Actually, one of the reasons that I personally got involved in this indexing idea is that I looked at how China's universities fare, and I was surprised how they can fare so well in the existing rankings, right? And the reason precisely is that academic freedom is simply not considered, and these universities are very, very careful about meeting those measurements that matter, because they are fighting for reputation. And as the knowledge production and the academy increasingly globalizes, I think we have to have the debate. How is academic quality and how is academic reputation defined? And I would like, if we have more data, to influence that debate in a direction that academic freedom gets considered better. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, to continue, of course, for example, there are authoritarian countries, they understood quite well about what they should do with ranking. Because currently Russia, Brazil, India, and China, they have been introduced the new ranking system, especially to these countries, just to be not ever be measured by this Western values. But my suggestion is different. Do you consider what could be alternative sources of information for the human rights, the infringement of academic rights could be? Because in my personal experience, I collected very trustful sources from the human rights report. For example, if we are collecting information about the imprisoned and detained people from the regular human rights report, we might just collect the information about how many students and faculty members were arrested. So that's my question. What kind of sources you might see?
So I've done that analysis for 26 countries over a period of 10 years. But it's a bit backdated, so it's from 2001 to 2010. So I can tell you, for example, for the State Department reports, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and Amnesty International, how many academics have they mentioned over those 10 years, right? But what we see there is very important information, very useful information, but there is clearly the effect of an attentional bias. So on some countries, on access, right? In some countries, Amnesty, for example, gets better access than on others, right? And it's not their fault. It's the fault of governments restraining them from accessing the information. But once you then see the data, you see you need to interpret your findings. So, for example, in terms of all political prisoners, not only academics, we found 2 names for North Korea. Now, that can't be right. And so I feel what we need to do is we absolutely need to look at events data, but these are descriptive statistics, so we need to either have quite sophisticated statistical models to analyze, and get a sense of the unknown population, or we need somebody with country knowledge to contextualize. And I think the latter is easier to organize, right? Even though that is a qualitative method and not a quantitative one.
Say something? There we go.
Yeah, just a small remark. As I not only an academic, but actually also work for Amnesty International. And I can wholeheartedly support what Katrin has just mentioned. The data is simply problematic. First things first. And even if you want to use it, the problem is that it's not only not representative and doesn't kind of adhere to the academic standards of reliable and valid data, but it also not always identifies individuals that are covered in those reports, be it urgent actions or others, as academics or students, right? For example, if you protest outside of your university, maybe there's a report by Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or another organization, but it doesn't affiliate the protest to the university or to the persons being students that were arrested. So how are you going to find out that these are infringements of academic freedom and not just general human rights violations? Very hard to pin down on a case-to-case basis, even based on the information that you usually get in those human rights reports, because they're not kind of having this concept in mind. I can tell you from my experience in Amnesty International, no one there considers academic freedom a relevant concept or category. So it's, you know, if they don't bear that in mind, their data doesn't reflect it, even beyond the data being problematic in the first place. That being said, I wholeheartedly agree that this is why we need country experts. And I mean, this is a big responsibility, but you can develop guidelines such as democracy indices have done, I think quite successfully and also transparently, asking a catalog of questions, giving them also not only the questions, but also guidelines on, you know, different points, cut-off points on several dimensions of violations and levels of violations. And I think that can kind of, you still need to rely on the human expertise of someone who you trust, of course, within a peer review process, to actually assess the violations that are going on and relate them to infringements of academic freedom or not.
I think we have time for one more question, sir.
Yes, thank you for the presentation and for addressing the concerns of ranking, for which I might add also another small concern, but still maybe not that small, which is by ranking, maybe the countries that are ranked among the top 20 would feel less accountable than those who are ranked in the bottom. And by doing that, we end up attacking the systemic problem, the collective problem, and we end up forgetting the individual cases which might exist in the top 20 ranking ranked countries. So there is a danger in this, and we might end up forgetting the individual cases by doing that.
Thank you, that's a very interesting point. We have time for one more question, I think. The lady at the front has held up a thing that says 2 minutes. So I'm waiting to know what happens when I get below 2 minutes. Right, where you go?
I was wondering whether you might consider balancing the index with discursive contextual analyses according to a certain number of variables for each country.
Yeah.
I realize that's complicated, but I don't see how you do context in a non-discursive way. That's one. The other question I had was about updates. What I mean to say is, wouldn't you have to build into this the notion, let's say a country at the moment in which you do your index is in conflict. So unless you update it, whatever it would be, 3, 5, whatever years later, you're going to be very skewed.
As a statistician, that's evidently the case. You'd have to work out how, it's an iterative process, you'd have to work out how often you do it, because there are costs and benefits associated with it.
So both issues, the contextual and
half a minute.
I have half a minute. Yes, there need to be updates, and therefore we need to strike a careful balance between being very comprehensive in the analysis and simplifying it so that you can actually repeat it, right? And yes, I mean, the ideal scenario that we have in mind, it depends though on the willingness of people to participate in sharing their knowledge, is to actually publish the discursive country assessment after a review, along with, you know, the numerical score, so that it could also, you know, be criticized and debated, and you know, that there's transparency and that we don't only look at the numbers but actually collect information. I'm told numbers travel faster than the discursive elements. On the individual concern, because it's important, I think one would have to be quite careful in the communication of such material that it's complementary to other efforts and complementary, you know, to other perspectives. It would be a bad impact if it pushed the individual cases aside, right? And I think one way to do that maybe is really to think about groupings so that, you know, that the top ones get scrutinized in a different way than the ones at the bottom, if that makes any sense, top and bottom. But, you know, I think the main point is that we need more data, and that I think we have an opportunity with that data to shape the discussion around university reputation in a way that academic freedom gets more attention.
Thank you. As was just said, we need more data, and I'd like to thank you all for attending this and participating. And I'd like to make a plea, then pose a question. If you do get a survey from us about academic freedom, please fill it in. Please tell your friends. And the question I'd like to pose at this stage is, if we as academics do not try and protect the freedoms that are meant to be for us, what example are we passing on to those whom we teach? Thank you.